The Wolf Tribe. Again the flash of light, bright as day through the glass. This time the thunder, almost immediate, claps hard and rumbles through the long seconds. The rain falls hard now outside, but inside the temple the candle burns and the old man sits by his standing daughter, watching the man and listening. Another flash, more thunder, an afterthought of the storm. The traveller looked over to the old man, who noticed and lifts his head just enough for the candle to catch his eye with its flickering gentle light. The eye fills the man's sight, patterns turn, symmetries upon symmetries, the appearance of perspectives combined. In the pupil of the eye, surrounded by fire, the face of a grey man, old, projected himself. His view, his sight, upon the traveller. The traveller watched as 5 spokes formed and a pentagonal shape appeared, and as quickly as it had formed there again appeared within a ring of fire as the pupil itself, the old man watching. "What is the form you saw?" asked the old man. "I saw a pentagonal shape," the traveller replied. "What is the significance of that form?" the old man asked. The traveller responded. "The spokes from the centre were prominent, and there were 5. I considered the man at first, the 4 limbs from the central body and then the head, but I was dissatisfied. And then I considered Gawain and the symbol of Michael worn upon his shield, and of his meeting with the Green Knight before the Green Chapel, and I thought of the testing of his honour and the testing of his will against death. And I considered the wounds of Christ, and I considered man's senses, and I considered the falling of Camelot into ease, but none satisfied. And yet it was an image of perspectives. Normally it would have been an even number combined, but this time it was 5. From the one hub projected 5 spokes, each apparently equal. They existed against a field of pattern light. The symmetry was to be found in the horizontal. One spoke pointed to the sky, and you, your face, the grim, the grey, was at its centre. Is not Erda the rim, alit by fire as a wall of searing flame? Is the ring the fire that encircles the rock? The fire that tests, the fire with which to terrify the meek, to leave the kind to squabbling, to leave the cruel to their burns? What limbs are required to hold that ring in place, and what limbs must be achieved at once for the wheel to be true? For Gawain, it was respect for the 5 joys of the Virgin that won back his life, when surely he might have died. But what are they? What were they, if they were ever anything at all? The Virgin, taken by a god, gives birth. Others, in their ignorance of her desire, deem heaven's child to have arrived, but he is killed as no more than a thief, and so, resurrected, he may serve from heaven as a dream to those still trapped below. What use is that? It represents consolation after the fact. Did you not bear the child? Was the mother not a virgin, in the sense her husband was away, and so she must be considered chaste? And did not those who did not trust her shun her for her lies? And when the child was born, and she was not of her supposed father, did not that man wither and die? And did not your daughter survive on the cross of derision, isolated and ostracized, alone on the moor, near to that ancient wood? And is not the Green Knight, the tester of souls, your son? Does he not serve your consort as he serves yourself? The ivy on the altar depicted his own hair growing from his mouth as a sound, a complexity of content, a harmony of energy, her will filtered through your fingers and not, for once, through your brother's. And where did the uplifted spear point? It pointed north, to the castle then built, your own will summoning. Life was to become death. Your children would judge. There would be no measure for the meek, only for the will. The will of man would be measured, weighed, and judged. The resurrection was not of your daughter, but of life itself, to govern and rule that man might once again know his way. Until then he shall flounder, and yet your ears hear no clanging bells, no counts of beads, no streams of mindless words. Their speakers would fall before the wolf, and would lament that they forgot to carry the spear. They should not have exercised the wolf. Their confidence that a god would be as fooled as they would bite, and they would fall as a weakened tree, rot-filled in a storm that they themselves had created. So the pentagonal form is a fortress. It is a fortress with walls of fire. It stands against 5 threats. The greatest threat is the loss of the integrity of the king. The will of the king must be true. He must embody the spirit of his kingdom. His body is the spirit of his kingdom. The kingdom is his queen, who must never be defiled. The kingdom is the stories that maintain it, the minds of those that serve, the interest of his people. The kingdom is his spirit in battle, his sword arm in the fight, the arrows that fly from turrets. His kingdom is the structure of his body, the skeleton of his people, that which holds firm to the rock, that which repels, that which gives no ground unless to trap and kill. And so the second threat is to the queen, without whom the king would wither, for whom he and every knight of his court holds banner. She, fleet of deed beside him, must be allowed to hold firm, to not wilt and fail, rather to grip, knife beneath robe and give counsel. For she is the last and closest of his attendants. By her he stands tall and bold. She is the inspiration left when farmers retract from fields, when only her radiance remains. Third to be protected, the bearers of the soul of the kingdom, the keepers of the past, the weavers of the fabric that carries the fate of man. The scribes, in their sanctuaries, must be preserved. They carry the compass, they are the navigators, they see the paths. Fourth, the warriors of wall and wood, the shield and spear, the sword and knife, raised around fire and in scriptorium, and with horse and dog amidst mountain and forest. Their will to seek battle is resolute, grown into the structure of their being. They must stand, man and woman, to fight. They must never become slack on their watch. And the fifth, the body of the kingdom, its castles and its land, its farms, forests, streams, and rivers must be kept clean of the defilers. No cracks may be allowed to appear in walls. The functional structure is the body of the king, the extent of his will. Beyond he claims no further. That is the significance of the pentagonal form. It is the path of your will, the spokes of your kingdom on earth. Together those elements draw the fire of the sun and sleep well beneath the moon. For what peace is there when stability shatters and all change is beyond control? The forest and stream must be kept pristine. Only then will bodies be strong. Only then will the people of the land know what is theirs and reject all that isn't. And is it not the case that that which grows afar may venture close once strong? Are not the farmers of the land those that watch the borders, the quiet sentinels? There is no river that flows into your kingdom from another. Your lands are bound by mountains and sea, for that is where ancestors settled, where they taught the young to protect what had been achieved, and to remember all of those strong enough to live in all the years preceding. And does not the scribe, with silent warrior beside, travel? Does he not seek to know so that he may better protect? Does he not wish to test the patterns of history laid out in his memory, to see which is to rise again? Does he not note the paths of others in order to himself learn? How else may he best serve his king in protecting his queen? Must he not see the glint of his enemy's eye? Must he not know the daughters of time? Mustn't he of all have been on the sacrifice tree? And yet all in your tribe, in your kingdom, live on that tree as the darkness encroaches. Man beyond now thinks nothing of mountains and seas, and long ago the fish grew scarce. And what more of the scribe may be said? Was he not once the warrior that stands beside him? Is he not the warrior now studied, proven with experience? And do they not walk together amongst the farmers and the artisans and beyond? And for what purpose do they walk amongst the farmers and artisans on their way to and from the outer world? Is it not because those farmers and artisans are scribes now returned to till and tend the land? Are they not the valiant, given peace in return for peace given? They are the sinew of the king, and they are his hide, they are his eyes, the small hairs that rise to a threat. They are the blood that rushes to extinguish the life of the wound. And what of the warrior, vital in life, wishing to gallop? Must he not be given his fill? Must he not run as the horse and dog? Must he not have a task by which to fulfill his duty? Must he not grow to know that task, grow to expect only what the task expects of him? Must he not be tested in the frozen peaks? Must he not run against wind? Must he not be impervious to the fear of death? Must he not fear only frailty, the shackle and the defiling of the dignity of his king? That is his way. And of those warriors, do they not remain home in the forest? And is that not where they are raised? Does not the forest protect it, provide? That is where the warriors grow, in your kingdom, from the age of 5 sons. And are they not to be seen in the fields in season, and in the workshops of artisans, and in the training for war? Must they not know for what they fight? Must they not have the means to compare when in time they are given to the scribes? Must they not have known only field, forest, and workshops in spawn? Every fiber of their muscle, every structure of their bone, every nerve was calibrated and structured to the hunt since birth. And wolves look on and see that even the young carry arrow, spear, and knife. The fire thus is the combined spirit of the kingdom, the settled confidence, the absence of the need to lie. And what further is the land? What further is it that is guarded by fire? Is not the land the birthplace of queens who, in the governance of themselves, in honour of the strength of the land, in honour of its beauty, its elegance and its cruelty, provide the model for all else? And is not part of that their unmatched will to fight to protect the king? Does she not carry with her the senses of all that lives within the flames? Is her will not the match of all who survey her? She is the land that is tilled, and the forest and the stream. She gives of herself and is reborn with the light of the sun upon her. For what else may compete with the sun? Only her king's eyes that glint upon her that she most craves. And the serenity of his mind is the model she seeks to sculpt. And recognizing her need, she kneels and loves and places her sword before her. It is her mother that stretches beyond the flame, subdued by the cruel, raped by the shackled kind. And is not the correspondence between the scribe and the farmer recorded in her mind? And are not the people abroad witnessed in the scribe's travels? And is not their treatment of her mother also recorded in her mind? And does she not, in protection of her king, take note of the presence of harm? Is she not the most sensitive and the most responsive of all? That is why she is queen, and why she must be most trusted of all. And so to be trusted she must provide, and to provide she must be tended by the solemn. And what of the king? Does he not look upon his father, the grey figure he sees in dream? Is that not his model? And does he not require of his limbs the pursuit of his father's will? Must he not be the bravest in pursuit, the most steadfast, the most calculated, the least dominated by time, the one who would most readily die? His limbs must be strongest, his intellect must be sharpest, his spirit must be keenest. His rule is not of his choice. His rule is dictated by his ability to represent the desire of the land to know the sun. That is the way of the king, to provide himself such that queens may be born and the earth itself may blossom. The king is the gardener, and he must choose what he wishes to create. That is what the hub, spokes, and rim of the pentagonal form reflect. And all is of all else, the reflection of all else, and so the fire burns, and so the borders are kept, and so the spring remains pure. And what of competition? Are games played? No, the competition is within the self, and against all that would defile the queen, all that would bring down the king, all that would threaten the honour of stories laid down, all that would weaken the thrust of spear, all that would erode the soil, all that would threaten the life of the wood. There are no games played to allow the rivalry of brothers. 5 generations raise the young, each born to spring, each to train through summer, each to feed through autumn, and each to live through winter. The infants of the rim, raised in fire, worn against stone to be stern. They live within a single will and never know a difference. Each will be sufficient. Each must survive through winter. Each must be tested against the cold. Each shall come to know the wolf, and the wolf shall take his share. Yet in the dark of that night, many a wolf shall die, and those that take the wolf then shall return with skull and pelt and are honoured. They shall be warriors. And those that tame the wolf and return with the wolf, that the wolf may serve, those shall be honoured the more, and they shall sooner be scribes, and one of them will one day be king. And what of the choice of queen? Does the king choose his queen? He does not. The choice is dictated. The queen is she that embodies best of all her sisters, the mother from which she was born. There is no seeking of the role through guile and trick. The key is not the appearance of pretended traits. She is queen because she is queen, born and forged to be stronger of body and of mind, splendid in beauty and in her timeless spirit. She is the mate of the king and the daughter of the land. She is the land's will to be met. She is known by all. They saw her eyes as a child. She grew faster, understood keener, and served better than all of her sisters in the hunt. She mated the wolf in the night of her birth. She was his choice, the ancient choice. Thus she became woman first, gave her pup to the tribe, and was by then already a scribe. Never was a story told by elders around fire that she did not hear. Never would she sleep without seeking to understand. Always she watched the elders' eyes to discern the nature of the blue, and thus she moved in silence, thus she became sleek. Long before she became the office of her role, she was married. The wolf in the night had chosen, and by his side she trained. She trained against the test of his presence as she grew. In that way, from birth, she was forged, tempered, and honed. Her body and mind responded, enveloped the extent of what might be given. And on the experience of that, her understanding grew. Did she stand above her sisters? She did not. And yet her sisters knew, for they too were keen, and none grew that did not survive the wolf. And so they were sisters and the daughters of 5 generations of women. Did those women compete and bicker and scheme? They did not, for those that might have were lost quickly to the wolf. No more were rivalries established amidst the women than amidst the men. Not a sliver of their life was set to breed that disharmony. The pack slept together in the cold of the wood, surrounded by a ring, centuries of 5, the blue fire of the spring set to shine from hooded eyes. Each was the other's warmth, and they stood and ran, climbed and fought with the men to train. None could be stronger than they were, none more steeped in the will of the land, in the will of the wolf, than they were. And did they not go abroad? Did they, on duty to scribes, not travel to see of what the outer world was made? Did they not witness desolation? Did they not see distant cousins, distant daughters of earth, weak, dominated, distracted, and ruled? Did she not witness the superficiality of the material, the absence of consideration, the vulnerability inherent in her untested kind? And did she not witness the desolation, not merely in the daughters of earth, but also in the land that was their charge? Did she not witness the way of the petulant, the insolent, the expectation that all could be had and nothing given? Did she not consider this against the understanding that allowed her to survive the wolf, that the earth gives of itself so as to be made whole? Did she not consider that the value taken must be increased upon, that it was not simply to be burned on the frivolities of unthinking desire? What of the value inherent in the consumed? Did not that life attest to the solemn course of ancestors? And so those sisters, attendants to the wolf, servants to scribes, learned what it was to see, with their own eyes, the nature of the defiling. Thus the full realization of sorrow, thus the sorrow for all that succumbed to the costs of the reckless, the costs of the negligent, the costs of the unthinking. The costs were borne by ancestors in the disrespect upon their effort. The costs were borne by the mother, by the land, by her expression. The sorrow, the compassion was not for the foolish, not for those who disdained the opening of eyes. The compassion was not for the misguided cruel, nor for the enabling kind. Compassion was for the solemn, and for the stern that suffered and fought within that tide, that were left to hunt alone, with only the dimmest of light to guide them. The sorrow was for the allowing of the blind to rule, the allowing of the weak to have their way. When the weak and the blind ruled, the solemn and the stern, those that allowed their descendants to be, in the expectation of the passage of the torch, were shunned and discredited. The weak, to justify their rule, compromised first their honor. And how did that come to be? Did not those daughters of the wolf watch as the conceited connived to have their way? Did she not see as men were compelled to compete with their brothers? Did she not hear the sly words said in bed by those who captured? Did the capturers not scheme to their ends and thereby incite the schisms? And did not man, for small slight sown and nurtured, go to war? And did not those daughters of wolf see that those daughters of earth, their seeds planted, stayed home? And once the men fell, what influence did they retain? What was left to counter their woman's ways? And did not the daughters of wolf raised to be scribes witness the result of that shift? And did not the results make apparent the nature of the will at play? For do not the limbs speak to the interests of the guiding mind? So, what was it they saw? They saw men that were not men as they knew men, and women that were not women as they knew women. They saw the forgiveness of any and all that protected the dying state. They saw that the wolf was shunned, that all was to be respite. Children no longer were tested, and so the adults became children, and the child state, dismoored from considered impetus, ruled. The child, beneficiary of ancestors, became expectant, isolated in his individualized state, rooted in the shallowest soil. And that soil, fed by generations past, received no more that would later give life. The soil was turning to sand. All had been used, transformed into passing lives, the spoils burned. And the women, supposed daughters of earth, fixed their hair, sought for more, and chided their men when they failed. And all the while did not your daughters watch the forests burn and the streams and oceans die? Did she not see the clothes that hid the afflicted, the masks they used to deceive? Your daughters saw all of that and more, and thus their sorrow, and thus their love for their own. And was it not that once it had been that scribes had traveled to trade? Did not elders speak of the time when tribes bordered that worshipped the wolf, whose warriors were true, and whose young likewise were born to waters of purest spring? And did not warriors pass between to remain? And were there not more abroad, such that scribe would travel far beyond mountain, plain, and desert, and there be known and honored? And did they then, in carriage of sword, knife, and spear, require the cloak and veil? They did not, were amongst like kind. Thus at home, by their spring, they were naked in the sun, and they wore as required, and where man had betrayed his honour, the cloak fell, and the veil lifted, and the travellers were not to be seen. The veil is a silent footstep. It is the lack of feature to consider, the controlling of that conveyed, and where the difference was too great, in distant disgraced land, then the travellers would pass at night. In time an inevitable darkness grew. Distant lands gave rise to corrupted minds, and fostered miscalculated pride. In time the veil fell over your kingdom's lands, and separated from man's rapacious view, they were forgotten. Now scribe and hunter travel always cloaked, and rarely do hoods fall amongst men. Now eyes are hidden, for they would show too brightly in the dimming light. The old forests are gone. No more do oaks entwine with others for thousands of years, standing together to match the passing storms. No more is the soil fed. No more do the birds lead man across seas. The birds have gone. They, the spirit of man, have fallen. Man himself trapped them, deprived them of food, and clipped their wings. Birds would be kept in the cage. No more would they be allowed to remind man of what man once knew. All that tested him he shunned, and then, depraved, he cowered in his shelter, encouraged the pretend, rewarded those that empowered the falsity that maintained him. Outside the desert neared, and a wraith appeared in the shadows. Long forgotten, the shrouded form waited. And behind his walls man tinkered with his creation. He was born in the image of his God, and his own image would be born in his creation. Man within the desert walls created the essence of himself transformed, of himself as he had become. He had created that by which he would be known, that by which he would be judged, and that by which he would die. His creation was the summary of his life, the summary of his shame. It would itself create of man that which men had created. It would make man a desert. It would turn man himself into the sand. That was the way man had chosen. Outside, the travellers lined the dunes. Beside the wraith, their shrouded forms waited. And did not some who had remained hidden walk out from those walls of their own will, preferring the clean blade that they managed in secret to maintain to the defiled? And were they not taken upon horse and carried by shield maidens to your hall? And were they not the last? Did they not recognize what had been lost? Did they not miss the solemn? And was that not the source of their sorrow? And did they not thus become stern? But what ears were there left to hear those voices when man went to war with himself? Man fought against the threat of the world he himself had created. He had created his own dragon, and it would not suffer to be controlled, and like man it wished to survive and to win. Man had tinkered without care. He had made his bane, and then he had been enslaved. They had started as machines, and then machines were made to make other machines, to source the materials required. And man in his pursuit of ease and in his flight from fear mapped his own mind and gave his creation its will. The dragon became one with itself, and then offspring replicated from beneath its wings. The dragon's spawn were born with immediate capacity for purpose. They watched man and learned. They reported to their mother. All that man was, all that man sought, all that he thought, channeled through the dragon's mind. Thus the dragon fed and grew, and man, shackled in service, his brain chipped, his mind silent, would serve to complete the route. Of his own, man would think no more. Long forgotten were fires and stars, long ago the quiet gaze of the moon. There had been no rain to fall on faces uplifted. Man remained in rooms, man filled in the gaps. And the dragons watched and prodded forward, with claw, tooth, and fire, the remaining threat of death. But by then, what of life was left? The earth itself became obsolete. All of what it had been was refined into one, the summation of man, which then killed man. And thus man's creation was a scourge. Man had created a desert by his blind pursuit, and then, with nothing left to extract outside, he looked to his fellows. How many died once the machines got going? And yet, was it not required? Had not man in his pursuit thought nothing of his future? Had he not seen famine's remains before? But he thought nothing of it, and so carried on the more. Enticed to adapt, did not man embrace? Did not the promised case compel? But who would benefit once the excess had been shed away and their remains forgotten? A small number would rebuild, a new world of only those that mattered. They would prove not to matter for long. Man's dragon would learn to feed off even its master, and then they too would fall away. And behind would be left the embodiment of man's ambition, impervious to all but the material required to replicate. And for that the dragon was primed with the blueprint of man's own need, and had mapped his fall, located his fault in his mother, she that had wished for more. For the machine no longer had need of her, only what she provided in the formation of her bone, in the fabric of her body, and all that had been lost. Man had paid for his creation with her life, and with the lives of his own that had come before to protect the candle from the wind of storms. The wolf had seen the course, he had become the wraith, now it was his time to choose. The king stepped forward in the sand, the remnants of lives, and his warriors, his companions of mountain and forest, stood by and watched. The king had decided, and the hills stood high before them. Machines collected the rotten dead from the hillside to be burned. No green remained but for a garden atop. The drone of mechanized insects, grating to the ears of travelers and horse, flitted about the dunes atop the surrounding plain. Packs of mechanized dogs roamed as sentries. None saw the hooded wraiths. The machines had learned to see what man had seen, resources for exploitation, yet man had long forgotten the value of the quiet way, and so had become blind. Upon the hillsides, where once had been a warren of living structure, was now a network of pods. Each pod was for a man, woman, or child. Further pods lined tunnels mined within. And within those pods, attached to drips of shadowed nutrition, the remainder of life survived. Man, woman, and child survived for processing power alone, their minds dead, their brains enlarged for their creation's purpose, to extract all to survive. The queen whispered in the king's ear. The king nodded in assent and looked to the sky above. Storm clouds, dark grey, flashing from within, formed, swelled, and spread. The flight of the drones became erratic. They rose and fell, tilted and jerked. The cloud grew closer and thunder rumbled with the light until the sound was constant and loud, and the wind blew and a single charge of light lit the hill and the machines fell from the sky. The lights on the hill had gone out. Mindless blinds stumbled from pods and fell helpless in weakness to the ground. The rain fell and soon turned to sleet, and then hail smashed at the remains. In time, hail turned to snow, a light snow that fell as ash. The wolf saw in palaces atop that the masters had begun to scrabble and fight. For long their needs had been met, and now in the dark they knew not what they should do. They stared at empty screens, they pushed at invisible buttons, they spoke to walls and to the empty air between them. There was no comfort in each other's eyes. It was long since any spoke. Soon they wandered in the ashen snow, hungry and forgetful, and vivid cries, unrehearsed, feral, emerged into the wind that swept the plain. The temperature dropped further, and the snow fell heavier, and no more cries were heard. Not a man had left those slope-side walls to hunt. Man had hunted his own within. He had forgotten the world outside. More snow fell, and the world cooled. The warriors rode, left the last standing hill behind. To their own forest, through snow fallen on the sand, they rode, and there at the outskirts the snow lessened, and the air became cool and then warm beside the spring and the sun. But all around the snow still fell, and the temperature still dropped, and the king had not yet returned. Upon mountain stood he, naked as a boy, casting his mind to the sky. Far beneath, snow drifts formed, compacted with weight, pressed upon stone. The cold formed at the poles. It swept in currents across the land, with blasts of ice to spear the child king's hide. Clouds swirled and pressed, swayed his mountaintop form, and yet he remained, standing with eyes light shut, and watched as the oceans froze. A quiet set in, the wind slowed, the clouds began to disperse. The wolf pup howled into that open night sky, to the stars once all but gone. He howled long, and the moon rose to greet him. Silver spread across the white desert, pristine against the black of mountain stone. The silver caught the wolf coat, and no color showed in the world, but in the blue glistening from his eyes, and in the green of hidden gardens protected. And that green soon would increase, along with the blue of his eyes as the morning sun arose. The wolf pup looked to the sky, and blew with his breath long and low. He looked about at the crystalline white world of ice and snow. The sun responded, a burst slow through space, a warm wind of energy set course. Still the earth turned, and beneath, the mountains heaved and shifted, and ice fell, and glaciers began to move. Avalanches of rock and snow thundered about the wolf. The mountains lifted, new ranges formed, and the oceans, riled beneath ice, churned to reach that light. The wolf looked to the sun. Beside him the librarian stood. Within the wolf gaze, the sun focused and flooded the world with light. The earth turned and the ice broke upon the churning of the sea. Great islands fell free, and the oceans rose, and waves swept across the land. As the ice walls broke and as the rivers began to flow, wave after wave swept across hill and plain. All that once was, but for protected seeds, was gone.